DORA is a group, DevOps Research and Assessment. They did a large study, and by large study of organizations, I mean 6 years, 31,000 plus professionals worldwide, various types of organizations from banks to government, everything in between. And it's almost the sociology of organizations. And they tried to find out what makes elite organizations that deliver software with quality more often. So that's the topic. Four key, the four key metrics is one of the things that they key on that can readily identify what makes an organization elite. So with that, let's go. I came up with the title DevOps and the four key metrics, and I, thought about it a bit, and it seemed a little like a movie title to me. If you ever grew up, like I grew up watching Kung Fu movies, it almost sounds like Five Deadly Venoms, if you remember that, but each one of the members of the Five Deadly Venoms had a different kind of tactic or skill set. And often when I talk to people about four key metrics, they're not sure how they all combine together and what they are. So I want to get as much or as many people into understanding and how to apply the four key metrics. It's more of an art, I think, than a science to applying them and measuring them, but we'll get into that. So in the book, Accelerate, there's this grid, and you probably see it or have seen it if you do any study or Googling on four key metrics. This kind of shows all the key metrics and what separates elite from low performing projects or teams. So I'm not going to read it off, but it's deployment frequency, lead time for changes, time to restore service, and change failure rate. So we're going to dig in on that and discuss it. And it's going to be pretty informal, and hopefully we come to an understanding or different ways that we can measure the four key metrics. So I said I was going to do another introduction or more lengthy introduction. I think this helps kind of give people a frame of reference of where I'm coming from. I'm an independent consultant. I started out doing a lot of waterfall projects. One particular project kind of molded me, kind of shaped my view on development as a professional. And it was a project where I was working 90 plus hours, waterfall, no end in sight. And I actually left the project and came back later, and they adopted something called Agile and XP, short for extreme programming. And I was pretty skeptical, never heard of it. It was some consultants from the outside telling us how to do things differently, more efficiently. And I wasn't sure it was going to work, but I remember thinking at iteration, I think 63, how efficient everything was. Extreme programming focuses more on engineering aspects like pair programming, mandatory unit tests, and things like that. So we had everything automated. If you checked in code, it ran the suite of tests, and it also had nightly builds, and you get an email telling all your friends and managers that you broke the build, and we'd fix it immediately, or whoever broke the build would fix it immediately. And it changed my view because I was working not 90 plus hours, I was working 8 hours a day, and we were getting more things done as a team. So I use that as a frame of reference to other teams, other places I go, to trying to get that, I think of as a nirvana for a project. So it's that Kaizen mindset of each sprint, each kind of iteration, how do we get better? How do we tweak things to be a better performing team? One thing I have noticed that I end up being the quote unquote DevOps person on projects, which I think is an anti-pattern. I even named it after myself, DevOps, that Dave or someone like Dave will do your ops for you, and it'll be fine. You just need to work on your features, and somehow magically it will get to the users. I think that's an anti-pattern. So the reason why I give talks like these is to get more people into the mindset and ownership of DevOps. And so a lot of times I also find myself on teams that are enabling teams. So if you think about the team topologies, it's a concept in book, but you have your feature teams that crank out features for users. You have platform teams that are, the infrastructure, they're building your Kubernetes clusters or what have you. And then you might have something like a big data team or special machine learning team that are doing something very unique, very different than the feature-driven teams. And then you have an enabling team, which helps all those feature-driven teams to do the work with minimal interruption. So it might be to on-ramp them to a new platform, going from, say, monolith to microservices or from on-premise to cloud, and helping them get there. So I find myself doing developer enterprise productivity. And the hardest part I've had right now is trying to figure out the best way to scale that, whether is it building the right tools or bringing the right people in the room. A lot of time is just talking to the right people to figure out those answers. So hopefully that gives a good frame of reference for, I guess, my particular background. So we'll hopefully get some people to chime in, but I'll start with the deployment frequency. I kind of think of the 4 key metrics as 2 sets or 2 halves, where you have velocity, which is getting your features to production. Like in a military sense, I've heard the phrase, you need to be able to get to the fight. So that's your deployment frequency. That's getting your features to the fight, to the users, and your lead time for changes. So how long from when you start something till, in generally, how long does it take to get there? So that's on the velocity side. And then on the other side, it's the stability. So once you get to the fight, can you fight? So will your services, features work as expected? So you have the 2 other metrics, time to restore service and the change failure rate. So it's 2 sides. I think you need to do all of them, all the key metrics, or understand all the key metrics, not focus too much on one because it's a balancing act. So in general, why would you measure metrics? And I'll open it up here. What would be a good reason to measure anything about how a team or team of teams performs? Feel free to chime in.
You can only improve what you can measure, right? You don't know if you're getting better or worse if you don't measure. You need metrics for that.
Right. So it's kind of like a baseline. Either your track coach or maybe your physician, you're checking your cholesterol every year. So you wouldn't check your cholesterol once and say it's done. You're good, and you'd want to check it at a regular session every year or so. So I think getting a baseline of these metrics is important to understanding how things have improved. And there's nuance in that, of course. But we'll start off with a few slides about deployment frequency. So this is how often do you deploy to production? So, you might have heard teams talking about, well, we have either quarterly rollouts or weekly rollouts, but it's how often do you deploy to actual production where users can use it? Elite teams deploy on demand multiple times per day. Now, that could seem crazy, maybe a few years ago, but I think it's very possible now. I think the key is for most organizations to figure out what is in their way that stops them from deploying multiple times a day. In general, you obviously have some basic ingredients, like you need to know the number of deployments. You have to have some way of saying, counting how many deployments do we do in a week. If you tend to deploy weekly, your deployment frequency will be weekly. If it's daily, it'll be daily. If it's a quarterly rollout, it'll be that. But the key is you should be able to easily manage the number of deployments, easily track them. And I always think of, instead of going with technology to, do Git pulls or Git metrics and commits, just start with, pen and paper or spreadsheet and just count them. Count them on your team and figure out how many deployments you've done. And hopefully you're tracking your deployments in general. So, we'll discuss this. So I practice martial arts, and when I was training, my instructor, Dan, I asked him a question. I said, I really want to kick higher. And this was his response. So if you want to kick higher, then kick higher, which didn't seem very helpful to me at all, but it's about, you just kind of think about it and apply what you need to do to kind of solve the issue. If you want to kick higher, kick higher. If you want to deploy more, then deploy more. So it's kind of a mindset or mind shift to thinking, what do we need to do more deployments? And this is just a general list of basic ingredients, but you can kind of take it or leave it. In general, I think you need a code repository, a build pipeline, some way to monitor, just because we deployed, well, what is a successful deployment? You deployed 1,000 times, but you had to roll them back, or none of them were successful, or only a handful. So you have to think about what you should do. And again, I'll open it up. Then how are folks really deploying now? And what does deployment mean to them? Is it users are using it? Are they doing some other type of deployment with feature toggles? Feel free to chime in. Or I'll give people a second if they want to chime in. So what I've seen is, being able to do a deployment check, not just deploying frequently, but understanding when I deploy, I need to make sure that I run some other parts of that deployment so I can check that maybe I'm checking the health endpoints to make sure I deploy correctly. Or maybe I'm doing things like before, just so I have, you could say you're padding your stats, but just so I have better stats, I can do pre-deployment checks. Because a lot of times I've seen things fail because of outside circumstances, things you're not aware of. So doing things like a pre-deployment script where I'm checking everything in the production target is ready. So it might be, I need a database. Let's ping the database as part of our deployment script to make sure it's, whatever ports need to be open are open. Basic things are met before we even decide to deploy. Is DNS set up correctly? Is the database up? So we don't even deploy if those things are not there. So those are things I think you can think about or reason about with your teams. In terms of practicality, there are many ways to measure deployment, but I think because of the success or the spread of the idea of 4 key metrics and measuring it, tools like GitLab have it baked in, at least almost. So they, in I guess the latest GitLab Ultimate Edition, they measure deployment frequency. That's one metric that's kind of done for you if you have GitLab. And it requires that you have an environment set up that's named production. So it's very easy to measure, and you can see, okay, this is how many times we measure. And in their pipeline, you can see, if you're using GitLab CI/CD, you can see, yeah, we measured to production and it either failed or it didn't. So it's very easy to track. So here are a couple ways to kind of deploy faster or more frequently, or as I mentioned before, kick higher. A lot of times I see on sprints, agile increments, everyone grabs a couple tickets, and then the end of the sprint comes, and then there's merge requests. And no one really has time to look at the merge requests because they're focused on kind of getting their own stuff done. And that becomes a bottleneck for the few people. Turns out it's like 1 or 2 people that kind of do all the code reviews. I think this is an anti-pattern. I think we should be doing less work and kind of helping each other do testing. So the idea of, take less work, it's better to be in a position where you're finishing work for a sprint than kind of rolling over stories. And in addition to that, what does it mean to go to production? If you create your features, do you go straight to production? Do you have a QA team? Do they do performance testing? How long does that take? Is it another throw over the wall to a separate QA team somewhere else in the building, somewhere else in your enterprise? What can we do to make that go faster? Do you have to talk to teams that are not part of your team necessarily? Change control board? Do you have to talk to security team to sign off before you go to production? These are things that can slow you down or slow a team down in their deployment frequency. Now, feel free to chime in if you have, encountered these, or, for some reason you think that this is not possible, or you have some other obstacles like I mentioned or haven't mentioned before. Give folks a chance to chime in. I'll ask another question. How many times are people deploying now? Are people deploying weekly, monthly, quarterly, several times a day?
Yeah, and I'll pipe in here, folks. Feel free to type in the chat box if you'd rather, or feel free to turn on your volume to pitch in. Looks like Ted here says that for him it's based on deliverable completion. Anderson saying it's done bi-weekly.
I mean, I've been to organizations when we deploy with every commit. And then I also been to organizations when we do it every 2 weeks at 10 p.m. and it lasts until 4 a.m., right? And so it depends on the organization, basically. Each organization is at a different state on how ready they feel about deployment. Like how it's a weird mechanics, right? It's like you feel confident to deploy more things that can break more things, and it's more dangerous, but you're okay with that, as opposed to doing little releases more often, which sure, it might break something, but at least you know what broke, right? You can roll it back. It's just, I notice it's a mental pattern in people's head as they get accustomed to the idea of like, we have to deploy more. We have to deploy less in terms of the changes, but more often. And I notice a lot of that has to do, with the psychology of it, but also with the tooling around it. So I've been to places where, sure, we deploy all the time, but guess what? We're always breaking production. And for some reason, people are okay with that, which is strange, right? It's all psychology. But then they know something will catch it, right? Alerting will catch it, and it's okay, right? Worst case scenario, we'll have issues for like 5 minutes, but then we'll do a hot fix and that will fix it out. Until people start realizing it's like, maybe we can put automation around it, right? The same test that we run for QA, maybe we can take a subset of those and run against production with example to deployment. Because like that's your smoke test, right? You already did that work. There's already monitoring in place so that will catch those kind of things. And I've seen organizations that also do the other way around, like they start getting very fancy and deploying things, and then they feel like that's too much, and then they have to step back. And so, like, I guess I would argue like the one size doesn't fit all, but I think there is a consensus on the idea that yes, you do want to deploy smaller pieces more often, and I think that's become kind of like the the holy grail nowadays. And I think that most organizations understand that. Like they know they have to get there. Even if they are not mentally ready for that, they are not ready to take all those steps and do those things, even though the technology is there. Most organizations understand that. That would have been a hard conversation to have 5-10 years ago, but now it's more like people know. It's almost like smoking, right? People know they don't have to smoke, but they still smoke. They know they have to stop. And so it's like one of those kind of things where like at least the consensus has been built. They have this at baselines to use your technology. And now people know it's like, okay, so we have to aim for that. We have to be better at it.
Right. That has been my experience. And, I always want to deploy more often. One of the ways that I practically could, we decided to deploy every sprint, say, and we had complex, features for government HR. We did deploy every sprint, every 3 weeks, multiple features into production, and we didn't have a separate QA. It was, we are a cross-functional team, but day one, I was team lead and tried to figure out the best way to do this to deploy every sprint. And instead of having like a throw over the fence to QA, because there's no fence and there's no QA, it was us, we decided to pair. So we team up with someone, one developer, one person that would write your scripts, another developer. And I called it kind of giving the answers to the test. So the tester on that side, on that ticket, would write a script in kind of a human readable format in plain English, given when then. So given that the user is valid for this role, then when they try to log in and create a widget, then they can see the widget on the dashboard. So that kind of language. And we write a bunch of these scripts until we thought about edge cases, happy path, sad path, weird path, and quote unquote, all I had to do, or all the developer had to do, was write enough code for those scripts to pass and automate it. And what we found was we went from a bash script to Java, and we kind of went through this process, documented everything, and wrote all the scripts. And we actually found that there were logic errors in the original Unix script that we showed to the customer when we showed them the automated scripts, the whatever hundreds of tests we ran. So it gave us more confidence that we were doing the right thing. And that's one of the problems people I see running into. Well, we need to do QA. Well, you can do QA as part of your team, as part of your process, and it could be enough to satisfy any typical QA process. Another thing I see is security. How do we bake security into the pipeline? People talk about shift left to security. Well, one way to do that is figure out what your security is measuring and then do things that automate it. So there are scanners. If you're doing containers, pipelines, there's scanners for that, and you can generate reports based on your findings of your images. And then doing that at scale, I would look to a team, an enabling team that would create those images or containers and templates for pipelines, so that not every team has to figure it out. So you can do things like bake in security, bake in QA as part of your process. Then when things are done, there's no reason you can't ship it. Obviously there's politics, maybe you might have a change control board, but you can do things like measure how long does that take from actual development versus going through the change control board. Some things take long to overcome, which I understand. So that's deployment frequency. I don't know. I like to spend, I don't know. I think this is one of the, it's not the most important thing, but it's something that as a dev team, you can definitely tweak and increase yourself. This picture is just an interesting picture I took at Hershey Park. They revolutionized chocolate production with automation. And it seems laughable, but they were, I guess people are, many people were making chocolate and wrapping those little Hershey Kisses by hand in large amounts. And you don't think that could be scalable, and it's not. So this Hershey Kiss contraption was built a long time ago. And I think about how much can be automated on a regular team. It seems odd to have to do everything by hand, even with QA or security testing. Some things should be done obviously by hand. You have exploratory testing or kind of ad hoc things, but large portion can be done ahead of time. So we're going to go into the next one, next metric, lead time for changes. So that's, I don't say controversial, but depending on how you look at it, but it's how long from code commit, if you like to think of it that way, to production. So how long from, git commit to getting that code in production. Elite performers do this less than a day. So in the morning they get in 9:30, whatever, and that commits there, and same day it gets into production. So it's faster than, Amazon Prime shipping. It's almost like Domino's shipping. So it's 30 minutes or less, maybe. Different scale or different speed. So that's lead time for changes. And I'll get to why, there's different ways to look at how you measure that. So one way is, like I mentioned, Git commits. You have a build pipeline, you have a release process. In your release, maybe branch, you have all the commits in that release branch or tag, and you count them when it was created and when it gets to production. And there you can check your lead time for changes. The other way I like to think of it is if you have a ticket management tool like Jira or Trello, use the ticket management tool to start when you tracked it and when you completed it, because you can measure other things. There's intangibles that are not just Git commits. Sometimes solving things requires no code. So you find that out, or things change and you adapt to the change, and maybe it's another team that's ending up fulfilling that function or feature. So I like to, depending on the team, the organization, you could use Git commits, but I don't know if that's necessarily the best in all cases. Ticket management, if you have it, you can definitely kind of see it. It started here and we put in production and it's done for that release. You put it from to do, progress to done. One of the things I try to challenge teams, if I'm kind of new to an organization, I try to test to see how long things take. So the quickest test is, do a commit with a comment. It doesn't change any functional code. It could be on the UI, it could be just a literal comment, HTML comment, a JavaScript comment rather, or a log statement, or on the back end, a log statement, and see how long that takes to get from git commit in production. And it gives you a gauge to see what things could trip you up, because it doesn't change any, change any features, or it shouldn't. That's an easy, quick test to see how things change. So I want to stop here and, obviously get some more feedback on what people think of how to measure lead time for changes. Do you think Git commits or whatever repository tool you're using is the best way to measure from, when it started to production, and what pitfalls do you see in that?
Hey, David, this is Ted.
Hello.
Great stuff you're giving out here. I have a question though. So based on what you're asking, and with such a quick turnaround from what you foresee from commit to production, is this based off of the assumption that the code has been, unit tested, regression tested, QA'd, and UAT'd before it's been committed?
Yeah, so that can vary from team to team, but following best practices, doing unit tested, and automating tests, and like I was mentioning before, building, maybe you're doing behavior-driven tests that you work with someone who's doing the QA, you write up all the scripts, and then you write code that will pass all those scripts, and you have your QA. Now, there could be more QA, exploratory testing, but at least you've automated the core QA scripts. So this is assuming, you're going to pay for it, as you'll see. Like if you just focus on deployment frequency, we're shipping as fast as possible. We have lead time for changes. It takes us 10 minutes. You might pay for it later in the other metrics where you don't have good code quality. So, you know, that's why you can't kind of take just these metrics and say, we're shipping very fast. There's more to it than that, because once you get to the fight, once you get your features to the users, how are you going to make sure they run as expected? They don't break. It's the right features you're delivering. So you're right to ask that. It's like, well, lead time for changes is short, but what does that actually mean? If you delivered poor quality code to production, does that really help your organization? Are you, quote unquote, an elite performer? I think not, if you don't bake in quality. So that makes sense.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So on the, that kind of segues somewhat into the other half of the equation of stability. So next metric is, time to restore service. So if something happens, and, something will at some point, how long does it take to resolve that service incident or defect? For elite teams, it's less than an hour. So something goes down, or, some stack traces in your logs, and how long does that take to fix it? And that fix might be a hot fix where, maybe you pushed out the wrong configuration. It could be a myriad of different things. How long does it take to fix that? Now, if you're doing things like canary testing, it's a little easier to roll back maybe, because you're only serving your current deployment to a small segment of your users. If you're doing something like blue-green, you're kind of testing out the production rollout and seeing if anything, breaks, just not serving any users, and you can easily roll things back. And, technically, you didn't restore anything because the users didn't get it, but you were able to make sure it will work when the users get it. So I think there's some nuance there where you can fix things before the user actually gets it. One of the key things I think about time to restore service, it's kind of obvious that you need to know that things were down. So part of knowing things are down, well, the easy route would be to wait until the user says something's broken. Don't recommend that route, because you have unhappy users a lot of the time, and you don't want to know. You want to know before your users do, obviously. So you think about tools like monitoring, logging, observability to see a process, service, application in action, making sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. So there's basic things like health checks, synthetic transactions. I mentioned before, doing a pre-deployment check before you deploy, make sure all your dependencies are there. And what I find that breaks huge or largish enterprises is lack of communication across teams, where one team doesn't know that they depend or are depended on by another team, and they schedule the deployment, quarterly, weekly, whatever, but they don't tell the other team that they're doing it, and that causes issues. And that's not a technical issue, it's really just communication. So I've seen a lot of interdependency issues across teams. And really what you're measuring is when you knew the incident started and end time. And that gives you your time to restore service. So that's time to restore service in general. What ways do folks kind of look to when they want to be notified that something is down? Or what are some techniques folks use to track time to restore service? Or do you track it at all? don't know if someone's in chat. I can't see the chat right now.
Yeah, Ted's saying that we need to. Thomas is saying it's not tracked.
Right. So that's what I find a lot of teams in that position. And, there's a million and one, monitoring tools, but what gets monitored the most are typically in enterprise are the services that are hit the most because they're critical. I would argue, yes, there's extra time that it takes to set up monitoring tools. Maybe you're doing it at the enterprise level and doing it and having end teams do it across the enterprise, figuring out how to do it the best is not as efficient. That's why I recommend, hopefully getting a small team that enables all the enterprise to figure out the best way to do that for probably 80% of the applications, just so you can solve things like that. And just so the feature-driven teams can just focus on building features and have this peace of mind that if something goes wrong, they monitor it, things. Sometimes it's pretty boring. Putting up a wiki page that says, team A is deploying here. Here are our dependencies, and it's these teams and the context for those teams. So anytime we're deploying, we'll contact our dependencies. And if you can kind of instill things like that in an enterprise where each team deploying knows who depends on them and who they depend on, it can be better. And sometimes it's just confluence or talking some, figuring out who's who on each team. But a lot of times we get siloed in our work, and that's what hopefully some teams can work across the enterprise and figure out how to best coordinate things like releases amongst teams. But yeah, this is one that I've been in situations where, it's been a day and, the application team didn't realize that, the users have been staring at a blank screen for a day, and they figured someone else would report it. And then finally, after a day, they said, they started calling the managers and saying, hey, it's been down for a day. And you don't want to be in that position where, users are down for a day in an enterprise or anywhere. So putting these, monitoring tools in practice kind of helps kind of figure out where the incidents are. And once you start seeing the incidents over time, what happens, you'll kind of narrow it down. You'll know that, hey, this database, for whatever reason, the database is always down on Mondays because they're doing kind of maintenance. So you figure out when to deploy around that, as an example. But there are other instances where it's just a matter of coordination. So, we're talking about, I think I as more of a developer, I kind of lean towards the first two metrics where let's deploy, and, get commit, let's deliver like dominoes, and like, let's get it there 30 minutes or less. That's great. But, the other side to that coin is change failure rate. So last metric is what percentage of changes to production or release to users result in degraded service. So you release something and, something had to be rolled back. Hot fix was needed, at 2 a.m. It's always 2 a.m. when a hot fix is needed. Or I like to think of it as this last one is features are not correct. And that's a bigger kind of topic, but elite performers 0 to 15%. That still seems like kind of a high margin, 15%, because, you deliver and 15% of the time something was wrong. But, that's going to happen the more you roll out. To decrease that, you can argue maybe you roll out in smaller increments, like folks have been saying. If you're only deploying 2 features instead of 10 every week, maybe you can just focus on the QA part or putting more checks in place. to measure this, obviously you need the number of deployments and number of incidents per deployment. So you need to track these deployments. And one of the things that's not technical at all is, well, at least I've seen at enterprises, is depending on your culture, you may have issues with following this through because some teams don't want to log issues. No one wants to admit that, oh, you know, that last deployment, we messed up, we had the wrong configuration, or we ran a disk space because the logs filled up, you know, our servers. And so honesty is one of the core things you need when, you know, looking at change failure rate. It's kind of admitting your mistakes. And I don't think you can compare any of these metrics. I don't think it makes sense to compare team A to team B. They're different teams and they're doing different things. So defining failure per team, it's their metric, their team, just like you wouldn't define any of your other kind of issues that way. So I love this picture to kind of illustrate the change failure rate, or kind of doing deployments that may require rollbacks. Sometimes you're going to get it right. And oftentimes you'll skip when you went wrong. And I think you should, you know, at least take a log or some kind of way, a diary of deployments to say what went wrong. And, you know, I did a checklist for a team once, and, you know, here are the things we're deploying just on a wiki, and so that I can have anyone on the team deploy. And if anything goes wrong, we start listing it out. So it could be that we didn't realize that team B was going to deploy this new API that's incompatible with our calls to it. So that's why we had to roll back. And that's fine, but you need to track those things so that you can adjust or accommodate for them. So I'm interested to hear like what people do, or if people have concept of, you know, tracking failure in their service, in their teams or enterprises.
That's a good point. And folks, feel free to type in, or you're welcome to speak up if you'd rather do that. Ted's saying here that it's not a formal process for his team.
Right. I suspect this is new. Like seeing these 4 key metrics, and I think we'll have enough time to kind of have just a general open session. This is the last metric, but I suspect this is new to a lot of teams. Having to measure, it's kind of easier measuring some metrics than others. Obviously, deployments, that's an easier one to measure change failure rate. But measuring it is as important as, you know, how many times you deploy, because this will tell you what to change, or if anything, or what you need to do differently in your enterprise.
Yeah, and kind of another note here, David. Ted's adding on that we hope to have the line of communication open to exchange, so it's more organic.
Right. And I keep hearing communication, but that, and I've said it a couple of times, and that seems to be the big driver. It's, you know, if teams or people communicate across teams out of their silos, that helps know what's going on and prevents, you know, failures or misunderstandings. And it's such a you know, when I first was thinking about giving this talk, I was thinking of all these tools and automation techniques, and there are plenty out there, but a lot of it comes down to being able to communicate. And that, of course, varies between your team, your enterprise. It's about your culture of your company or project in general. So I think I covered this next one. Skip that one. Some illustration of how folks could do this measuring. So I was mentioning GitLab, not promoting anything, but this is a tool I've used in the past, and you can do it with other tools. I think more and more companies that build tools like GitLab, and I'm sure GitHub will be doing the same thing, is incorporating 4 key metrics inside of them. So as mentioned, this is just, I didn't create the pipeline. It was generated using auto DevOps. And there's a build, there's a test, production, and performance, different phases, and each has a step, and production is measured by that production section, and it's either a green check or it's a red X, I think. So I can check if I deployed successfully to production for this, this pipeline. And it makes it really easy to reason about, but typically it's not always that easy. There are processes that you have to put in place, and there's communication you have to do with the enterprise or platform teams to do things like, I'm a development team. I want to deploy to production. So what do I need? And you have to go through some checks. Are you allowed to use SSH keys to deploy your code? Or do you have the right accounts? So that's always the last hurdle for me a lot of times at enterprises when I join a team or project, is figuring out, we can do CI all the time. The CD, the continuous integration is easy, but sometimes you get hung up on the continuous delivery because you have to work through the channels of the enterprise and figure out the best ways to do that. But once it's done, I think that can scale. You can make templates. Different tools allow you to do that. So not everyone has to figure this stuff out. And granted, you just saw 4 key metrics, but it's going to be, it takes some time to understand each one and put it into practice. So there are tools out there, and one tool that is still young, but I do some work on the side and some major projects with Google Cloud. And they have an open source tool that they put on their blog somewhat recently. So it kind of takes your GitLab or GitHub commits and figures out, I mocked up some metrics for this dashboard, but looks at the daily median lead time to change, daily deployments, median time to restore, and your change failure rate. So you can eventually get to this part where you're tracking these in a dashboard, so you can just in general see, and it's never a, you're not done. You're never done with this. You're kind of tracking as you go, because obviously projects will complete. You'll go to maybe operations and maintenance mode, or you're not doing as much work on it. You're tied into some other features or new projects. So that obviously can skew these details. But this is a promising project. I'll give links at the end before we discuss more. But I think seeing it, and that's why I mentioned earlier, start with spreadsheets, start tracking these metrics. You can do everything with spreadsheets. You can create graphs like these with spreadsheets, with Excel, or whatever you want to use, Sheets, Google Sheets. But start there, start simple, and do one metric at a time. Some of them I know are going to be easier, because if you're not measuring or monitoring any failures, how will you know? But at least start with the ones you can track and work to track the other ones, because obviously there's been a ton of research done on this topic by the DORA team, and I gathered some of these ideas and information between my obviously experience, but then mostly from the book Accelerate, which I'll mention or just mentioned. So with that, I'll say, here are some of the links. One link for that DORA accelerates the book. GitLab, I think most people are familiar with GitLab, but the way to measure those with that dashboard I just showed is in that blog. With that, I think I'll open it up to any discussion and what folks might find, I guess, preventing them, or what they think in general of the 4 key metrics. But before I do that, I'll say, ways to get in contact with me. If you have any feedback of this talk, obviously you can just email me, or I like to do office hours, and you can schedule some time to chat with me. And with that, I'd like to open up to anyone who has any kind of feedback or questions about the 4 key metrics.